Welcome to AI in Design, where we explore how artificial intelligence is reshaping the world of design. I'm Nick Martellero.
And I'm Dan Saffer, and we're faculty at Carnegie Mellon's Human-Computer Interaction Institute. Each week, we break down the latest AI developments, dive deep into topics that matter to designers, and talk with fascinating guests who are right at the intersection of these fields.
Whether you're a designer working with AI or an AI practitioner interested in design, we're glad you're here.
We're catching up on some news this week, including the launch of Claude Design 2.0 that happened right before Config.
Also, friend of the pod, MC Dean asks, who sets the quality bar now?
Emily Campbell lays out the layers of AI experience.
And finally, Perplexity launches Brain, a self-improving memory system.
All right, well, before we dive into all that, Nick, I've talked extensively about this. My brain is full of this, but anything you want to note about what Figma launched at Config 2026, since I was there and you were not?
So I felt like a lot of the announcements were a bit muted to me. And maybe that's just because I am not as big of a Figma user as I once was. Maybe it's because there are other big announcements that are happening and news stories in regards to like Claude Design and other things. And so some things can get overshadowed. It felt like there were a lot of nice feature enhancements with things like Figma Motion. I mean, that looks cool. At the same time, Framer Motion has been around and there's been other motion tools. I think putting it into Figma makes a lot of sense for the users. I think it's a great enhancement for power users of Figma. The shader stuff was fun. I've never been a big shader designer, but I think it's cool. I actually felt like the thing to me that was the most exciting was the generative plugins. And there's two reasons for that. The first one, I love design tools. I love building design tools. I love thinking about design tools, and the idea of giving your users more ability to design their own design tools, I think that's great. And the ability to do that with generative AI now, where you basically can have the system code up a plugin for you that's going to work well for your workflow, I think is awesome. Also, as someone who's tried to design Figma plugins in the past, I've felt sometimes limited, or sometimes it was just tough. Like you got to learn their API. And when we were hand coding that, it wasn't super easy. And so I love that idea. I think one of the things that maybe isn't discussed as much, but I thought was really cool in some of the fine print, was that when you create a generative plugin, it costs tokens to generate it, because basically you have to have AI generate the plugin for you. But when you run that plugin afterwards, it doesn't cost you any tokens to run, probably because it's using the API tools, it's using the capabilities that Figma has to do stuff. And I thought that was really cool, because it means that things that you might have done where you ask AI to do all these things, and this is how I am working in some cases now. Like I am asking Claude to do the most ridiculous, simple things now. And I know I'm burning tokens, but it's like it's a path of least resistance. By building these plugins that leverage the capabilities and then now can work for free effectively for you and your team members, I think that's really cool. And I also think that's something that could really differentiate Figma in regards to tools that designers want to use, because you can think about your workflow, you design your plugins, and then you have now all of these specialty tooling that it works for your workflow and how you like to do things. Also, the Figma plugins are probably deterministic, as opposed to sort of like, well, the AI might do it well, or it might not do it well this time. So I actually think that was a really cool thing, and something that could help Figma to really differentiate itself if people dive in and like build a bunch of really cool plugins for their workflow, so that Figma becomes a very customized platform for their team.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought of it like that, but you're right in that it does a couple things at once. One, it helps you customize and you're not burning more tokens. Two, yeah, because you're customized and you can able to build this thing for your particular workflow, that's more of a lock-in for them, right? That where you're like, okay, well, I've customized this thing to be all set up for me, and I don't want to leave the platform that I know to go somewhere like Claude Design, for instance, where I don't have access to my plugins that I may have spent months and months building.
Right. And in addition, I don't have the way to call those types of workflows or plugins right now in Claude Design, but we- we'll get to we'll get to talking to Claude Design, and we'll see how long that lasts. But I think given the fact we learned, for example, the AI in design report, the 2026 report that we talked about a couple episodes back, there's a lot of designers who are using code development tools to create their own design tools. So I think that this feels like something that users are going to want as long as they actually know that it's there and they use it. And another thing that I think is going to be potentially very interesting is, will Figma figure out how to recognize what users are trying to do with the AI and then say, wait a minute, we can build a plugin for that. We actually have the API calls for what you want to do. We can make that so you don't have to burn any more tokens to do that type of workflow. And we'll just create or recommend that you create a plugin for this. That's where I think it could get also really, really exciting, by them analyzing, looking at it, what it is that the users are trying to do with, say, Figma Agent, and then saying, wait a minute, that could just be a plugin.
And if they notice you doing the same thing repeatedly, it's like, well, how about if you make a plugin for this?
That also could potentially help them to improve the Figma API itself and the Figma platform to allow for more capabilities. And so they can basically keep improving the Figma platform based on that. I could totally imagine that as at certain points, if you recognize that there's all these people creating these plugins. And I don't know, they have to probably think about the user privacy aspects of things, because maybe those plugins might represent, proprietary, or like, I mean, that's some secret sauce workflow that your team has to work faster. I don't want the world knowing that. At the same time, there's a lot of people who share plugins freely online. So maybe there'll be options to say, oh, I generated this plugin, and like share it with the community or share it with Figma. So it'll be interesting to see how they use this. So that's my thing. I think that that's probably one of the most interesting things that I saw from Config. And I think that feature could be really cool and could be used to great effect and to great return on investment, actually, for Figma power users who leverage it and actually build things to make Figma work even better for them without always having to be like, cool, I'm just using AI to make it work faster.
I think there was a handful of things that you and I and probably our audience were really interested in, and this was the most baked of those things. The other things like code layers and skills were kind of like, yeah, those are coming. Code layers particularly was like, here it is, and it looks great, but don't look too close under the hood. And skills was just kind of like, yeah, that's coming. We're excited about it, and no more details on that. So looking forward to seeing that when that appears.
I agree, but that actually leads us into our next story, which is Claude 2.0, and the fact that they are basically able now to do a full round trip between the sort of Claude Design and Claude Code, and being able to go back and forth between the two systems.
Right. So while we were out and right before Config, Anthropic launched Claude Design 2.0, a major upgrade. It introduced things like canvas editing, design system importing, the shared usage pool, and the seamless two-way integration with Claude Code. And the thing that I was like super excited about, because I know this is the hobby horse that we ride on this show, is that you no longer have to rely on text prompts for these tiny tweaks. You can just drag and resize and align
Direct
elements.
manipulation.
Direct manipulation for the win. Exactly. So the stuff that we really like and that designers really like and makes life so much easier is now much more functional. And the joke I was saying at Config was that Figma is trying to move more into the code space, and Anthropic and Google were trying to move a little bit more into the canvas space. And so I guess we'll see who grabs it first, or who grabs the most first. Couple other cool things about Claude 2.0. You can now pull your design system straight from a repo or a Figma file or a code base. So instead of Claude guessing this is what your sliders look like, it actually knows what it looks like. Thought that, of course, is going to be beloved by everyone. The other thing about having those components in your system now is that Claude will do a self correction against your design rules before it even shows you anything. So it does this kind of verification loop before it presents its output to you, and not afterwards. So that's, I think, great. a really nice addition. And the last big thing was something that everyone who tried Claude Design in the first round was like, oh my God, I just used all my tokens in like 3 rounds of this. And now your entire pool of tokens, Claude Design doesn't have a separate one. It's part of your subscription now. So that I think will be a big bonus to people actually starting to adopt this tool a lot more.
The Claude Design updates, they're coming fast. And to maybe what I was speaking about earlier, the plugins are cool. And I just wonder how much longer it'll be before there's plugins for Claude Design, because it's a good idea. And you might want to do stuff in a more deterministic, or things that are like workflows that shouldn't cost as many tokens to do.
Well, here was my question about that. The thing about plugins on Figma is it kind of makes sense because you kind of get this like easy access to the general Figma plumbing, but I'm guessing the plugin is mostly about getting access to sliders and having some kind of your own direct manipulation for something that you want to do rather than have a skill that does it the same way all the time.
Yeah, I think it's really just like the plugins are really about controlling the API, which is nice because those are deterministic functions that Figma's already provided to you. Whereas I don't really know, there's no API for Claude Design. You just ask it to do stuff. So arguably it would just be, you have skills. And so you could just write skills. And I think that's maybe something that I don't see as well integrated into Claude Design as of yet. Like, actually, as I think about it, there isn't actually an easy way to attach your own skills. Like, you can add your design system and you can add it from a bunch of different places. But when you go to skills, there's a create and it's make a deck, make a doc. It's all these things that are just fixed and it just says use, but there isn't a give it another skill. Like, it has actually its own front end design skill, but like, you can't give it your own front end design skill. You can attach a code base, which I'm sure you could put skills in, but it's not so easy from what I can tell here. Well, I imagine we'll see how long it takes for them to add that. But so here's something, right? Right now, I don't really have the ability to update and change Claude Design to work how I want it, which is also kind of similar to like the way Claude Code works. And this is where the differences come with, say, people who are designing their own harnesses and they're using open code or Pi. So these are editors that manage agents and they do agentic coding, but you define a lot of how they work. You define how it iterates and how it looks at things, how it does, say, self-correction. Whereas within Claude Design, I don't get to change that. And actually, it's an interesting thing because there are tools that are trying to mimic the open source kind of, you can design your own coding harness. Open Design is a project that is sort of the open source equivalent of Claude Design. And the cool thing about it is that you can go in and you can muck around with it a lot more and you can define it to work the way you want it to work. And it's interesting where actually, now that I think more, I know that we keep talking about the Figma plugin thing, but that's sort of like a middle ground here where Figma's made a lot of good decisions for you, but you still have this ability to say, I want to make Figma, the tool, work in a certain way for me. And I don't really have that here with Claude Design. I mean, that's something that maybe is a bit limiting. But I imagine for most people, especially if you're using Claude Design as, say, someone who's maybe a software developer and you're mostly in Claude Code all day, like Code Design is an awesome way to say, oh, cool, now I've got like a front end interface to actually come up with how I want something to look, as opposed to always having to write it in code and then just debug it in a browser, right? This is a way faster iterative loop to figure out the front end.
Again, it's like you're right there. You're already in the tool. Why wouldn't you just flip over it and do it that way? But I mean, designers say the same thing. Like, hey, we're already in Figma. Why am I going to jump out to Claude? But also, it also seems like one of the things that Figma said is that you can hook it up to your AI of choice.
And I'll say, I know our listeners are probably like, oh, you guys are really Claude fanboys here. But part of it is that everyone figures out what they work with. But, Codex is pretty good. And I know a lot of people who shift back and forth to Codex. So while I think that Claude Design is exciting and it's interesting, I don't know how much lock-in it's actually going to give, given the fact that the whole ecosystem changes so fast. And every week, some other coding agent is maybe getting better. And thus, that's where companies like Figma or open source projects like Open Design have a leg up.
And let's not forget that Claude Design didn't exist 2 months ago. This is a new product. It's literally fresh out of the oven. I mean, that they did kind of a pretty big update like 2 months later. That's pretty impressive. So who knows what it'll be like in several months from now. I mean, the speed of these things, like you were saying, it's incredibly fast. So stay tuned for more on the Canvas Wars. Dun, dun, dun. So let's move on. Our friend and former guest on the pod, MC Dean, maker of many design skills, has a new article out called Who Sets the Quality Bar? And what MC is talking about here is the gap between the demo that you make and the like shipped user experience. And it's this pretty large design gap. And the reason it exists right now is that usually nobody has set any standard before the building started. So she basically answers her own question. She's like, nobody owns this. And this is kind of her response to the AI in Design 2026 report that the Designer Fund put out a couple weeks ago, and talking about just this gap between these unreliable, inconsistent quality that these models put out and where you would like to go. And there's no one that owns that. And some of it does come out of a good problem here. And the problem is that designers are actually starting to build tools for other people to use. And they are creating design system components and brand guidelines, and they're putting those into coding tools. And so anyone can use them starting from this shared quality baseline. So the intent is really good here, and it's the right way to go. But in the end, between that, where the designer is setting up all these things and something going live, things get lost. And so that's what this article is talking about.
So a question I have isn't is it that nobody owns this, or is this what the product manager or the team lead owns? I mean, when I'm looking at the markdown file, these are really great questions and things to think about. Who's the user? What's the purpose? What does this solve? But they also do feel to me like things that a team with a mature design process would be managing. I guess, is it that just that people now are building so fast that like they're not thinking about this? And this is why you got to have the skill file to kind of like, whoa, let me help slow you down there a little bit. Make sure you got this.
Right, exactly. I think that's it, is that some of the stuff a PM or a designer is not looking at, maybe not even an engineer. Again, these are tools that maybe someone from HR is like, hey, I need to fix this widget in the HR site or whatever it is. And whoops, something gets shipped that doesn't meet the quality standards. And it's like, well, whose fault is that? Is it the people who never even saw it? Is it the designer up front? Is it the HR? It's like, it's nobody. It's kind of, it falls between the cracks. And so, of course, MC being MC, she actually does create a template for setting up the quality criteria, and you can get it. We'll again link to this in the show notes, but she sets up a quality bar .md file where people can just use that before you build, making sure that some quality bar has been set before something goes live.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is interesting about this, and again, because it's an encoded skill, is that this gets shared with the team. Maybe it gets put into whatever tool that you're using. It always accesses this. And it's potentially been written by maybe team members who've thought about it, or it gets called by your AI coding assistant and says, hey, before I move forward, we got to talk about this quality metric stuff and let's fill this out. So I could actually see this as a really good way, but simply just even saying like every time, we start a new project, no matter who you are in the company, right, you've got to fill this out before the code agent moves forward. And this probably would do a lot to help improve the quality of things. And then also, if you have any kind of institutional sharing of these things where it could say, hey, here's what other people wrote, or here's our template within our company, especially, if you're working on, say, a product, any feature effectively could leverage the same thing. But I really like your idea here of like, oh, people in HR, people in business operations being able to build their own tools internally. And hey, also, those should be of a certain quality for our company.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, as we start democratizing design and engineering further away from designers and engineers, where all that stuff is now scaling in such a weird way, we need to figure out how the tools work when there is that weird gap between the people who used to, frankly, gatekeep who gets stuff put in the product for good reasons. One of them being quality. Now we're starting to see that with these tools, anyone can contribute to pieces of the product for good and for ill.
Yeah, and this brings up something that we've talked about on the show before of this sort of future or probably forming role of an AI design ops.
Yeah, it was how do we change the design ops role to be more this, where it's how do we scale the design team so that it then touches all these folks? Because the design ops used to be how do we have the design team make the most impact? And now it's, well, how do we make design more broadly have a bigger impact across the company? It's a twist on the design ops role.
Yeah, I'll say if there's anyone out there, I know we've talked to some people who kind of have talked about that and like they're trying to do it. But if there's anyone out there in that role, or you're like, oh, yeah, that's what I'm doing now, it'd be cool to talk to you and hear about how you're implementing it at your company or in your organization.
All right, moving on. So, our next topic is an article called The Layers of AI Experience Designing Beneath the Surface. And this is an article by Emily Campbell that I happened to meet 2 weeks ago now at Config. And basically, what this is sort of a riff on my old friend Jesse James Garrett, his seminal elements of user experience diagram that every design student and every designer post 2000 has had to look at and learn and think about. And her take on this is that the elements of user experience basically works when you have a deterministic system. And it is a very kind of deterministic model of design where you did this and then this happened and then that happened. And you made these stacks that all kind of built on each other in a predictable way. What she is trying to say is that now that we're in kind of the era of generative AI, our product systems have become a lot more complex. And so we need to actually start to think about what the layers of AI experience actually are, because the layers actually become not as much fixed as they are in Jesse's diagram, but they become much more interdependent on each other. So you may have user interactions that then go down all the way to the governance layer up through the model and through the harness so that maybe they come back in a different way and change the user interface at the top of the model based on the behaviors that it's doing, constrained by the harness or the context that it's in or the governing model. And so the layers of user experience start to really shift in a kind of a profound way so that they are just much more interconnected and much more fluid in a way that we have not had prior to the last couple years in this kind of realm of generative AI.
Yeah, this article is quite comprehensive. I really like the breakdown here because it does take you through sort of all the areas. I think most people, maybe our listeners, probably you're going to be pretty aware of the top two and maybe the third one. Of course, the user interface and the context. I think a lot of people are understanding how context is driving things. I think more and more people are kind of thinking about harnesses and sort of how you have agents that are orchestrated and working in the background on things. And I think that you're going to see more design work in the harness layer. One thing that I thought was interesting and I'm glad was brought up was the discussion of the emergence layer,
Yeah, I was going to talk about that.
because this is something where it's fun actually when you scroll down, the emergence layer in the little cool graphic actually becomes this weird amorphous cloud instead of like, oh, it just highlights the layer block, which I was like, that's cute. And I think, representative of emergence, because it is this weird thing of these things that come out of the AI models and the AI systems that just were not really predicted, and it's hard to control. A good example that gets brought up in the article is the OpenAI Goblin incident. For those who might not know, OpenAI all of a sudden started talking about goblins in all kinds of weird places where it didn't make sense. And basically, what OpenAI kind of determined was they tried to give a little bit of a training incentive to make the personality of ChatGPT a little more geeky. And then that just like led it to sort of this space within the embedding space of like geeky goblins and fantasy stuff. And so it started mentioning goblins all the time. And they've eventually fixed it, but it was just sort of this thing that came out of some of the ways in which they were trying to train and tune how it was behaving. And so there's all kinds of things that will happen like this that we don't really understand. And I think that understanding that that's a thing, being aware of it, and probably being able to monitor for that kind of stuff is going to be really important in the future of AI-driven product design.
Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of emergent behavior, everything from the way that sentences are phrased when they're written by AI to six fingers on hands. That was a big thing for a while too. And I think having that as part of the diagram here, that's one of the things that makes this a probabilistic setup versus something that is very deterministic. Not the deterministic things also can have emergent properties, but it really has emergent properties when we start talking about probabilistic systems as well. Like the weather is another great example of a probabilistic system. All kinds of stuff. That's why we can't have super accurate models, because there's a lot of probability in complex systems like the weather or AI systems.
The complex systems is an interesting segue into our last article for the day and thinking about memory, because it adds another layer of complexity. Memory systems are going to also become an important part of how AI products probably start to work as they work more and more with people, and people expect AI products to know more about them and to be able to remember things when they come back to using those products over and over. And that does lead us into our last story of the day, which is Perplexity announcing Brain, which is their approach to AI memory systems. Specifically, Brain builds a context graph of the work that Computer, which is their AI agent system, what that system does. And the thing that's interesting here is that oftentimes memory in a lot of AI systems is about the person, the user, like their preferences, their thoughts, like things about them.
Right. They're a personal context.
Exactly. Whereas this is actually specifically more about the work that the agent does. And it tries to effectively remember more about what worked, what failed, what corrections got made, so that it can learn to do better, which is actually much more in the line of, oh, I'm using AI as a worker. This is an employee, and it should be learning and remembering when I've given it feedback, when I've said, hey, that doesn't work so well, or that was good. And yes, that let's accept this type of output. And so it should be learning from that.
Right. It's the AI as teenage intern idea, right? But for the longest time, the teenage intern does not learn. Like you sense, no, stop doing that. And it never learns. It'll always keep coming back and doing that. And now if you're doing some kind of corrections, hopefully the agent can start to self-improve based on the corrections that you're giving it, just to make itself smarter. And what I thought was kind of cool about this is, or maybe kind of funny about this, is that it starts building basically a wiki of what it's doing and the context, and presumably you can go in and edit the wiki and do stuff just like you were, editing your company's intranet in what year was that be? 2005,
Yeah, I'm just
2010?
imagining our listeners here shuddering at the thought of editing a SharePoint. And actually, it's kind of fun because we have had company intranet wiki systems, and they are a great way to organize knowledge about certain things. They're just hard to edit. And so now when the AI is editing it, it's sort of effortless. And so the fact that the model still works, what works well for human teams, if kept up, if maintained, also works for an AI. That's kind of cool.
Well, I just happened to see the memories that Claude has been keeping of me today. And speaking of these emergent properties, Claude thought that we had renamed our podcast here. He thought we had renamed it Magic. That it used to be called AI and Design, and now recently it's called Magic. So yeah, I don't know how or why, but welcome to Magic,
Can
everyone.
you ask it in what chat?
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah, try it.
Let me see. Why did you think my podcast was renamed to Magic? Should I spend a whole bunch of Fable credits finding this?
Yeah, you only have them for another day.
I might as well burn them. Yeah. Let me look back to where that so it's searching now. I have it. I have it. So the transcript file, back in mid-June, I uploaded an episode transcript named Magic Episode 2. And where that comes from is that Riverside creates these magic episodes where it does its own little take of it. So a file called Magic Episode 2 looked like a rebrand. Funny, right? So who
That's
would have
hilarious.
right, so from a file name, again, I could not have predicted that when working with this. And so interesting the kinds of context that is being picked up and possibly used.
When you told me this, I was like, "Oh, I want to know what it knows about me." And I opened it up and realized that for my Claude, I had turned it off at some point. I guess I never let it have any memory, and so that it has no memory for me, which funnily, the analogy that you're using of like, oh, it's like a high school intern that's like super eager and doesn't always learn. I've also noticed, I'm like, yeah, it doesn't always figure out like this is how I like to work or please do this. Like, I really feel like actually when I fire up a new chat, I'm like, this is like a new Claude. I know that there are other things, for example, for Claude Code, like Claude.md files or other types I can keep my skill files and things. And those, of course, I put the skill files in and then it's remembering certain things about how I like to do stuff. But it's always felt like a very manual process. And this is something that, of course, I think that is cool about what Perplexity is trying to do here. Probably what Claude is trying to do with the memory and what OpenAI is trying to do with any of the memory systems is how do you make this a self-improving system? How does the thing learn on its own so that I don't have to go in and always be like, oh, let me edit this. Let me include a skill file. Let me update your memory or what you want. Like you just learn from interacting with me.
And Gemini has a lot of this as well. And it has a leg up on all these systems in that it's got access to my Gmail accounts. It's got access to my search history. It's got access to my calendar. It's got access to Google Photos. So Gemini actually knows quite a bit about me. So it knows, like, for instance, that I rescued a dog a couple months ago. And so now when I ask for restaurant things, it sometimes will say, I know you have a dog. Do you want to look for dog friendly restaurants and stuff like that? Sometimes negatively, where I'm like, no, I just want a restaurant. But I think that is an interesting other source of personalization and memory that I would guess that Gemini of all of these different AI knows the most about me right now in the most three-dimensional way because it has both my personal stuff and all my work kind of life.
Mm.
Now, I have been working on this other book project, and at one point I was researching like hairstyles for older black women, and it thought that I was a fiction book, nothing weird. And it's like, are you an older black woman? Shall I point you to different stylists in the area? And I'm like, no, 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 no. So, but for half a minute, I was like, oh, could I mess with Gemini and be like, why, yes, I am, to throw some chaos into the system. But I didn't want the algorithm to get all weird on me. So I decided not to do that. But yeah, I think this idea of memory and knowing context and remembering that and changing things is really interesting, whether it's personal or behavioral, like from an agent taking action on my behest.
Yeah, one of the things you make me think of here too is also the ability to go in and edit, but also the ability for it to forget how does it forget effectively? And then also, how can I go in and, eternal sunshine of the spotless mind it and remove certain things? Because there's definitely stuff I can imagine I want to pull because it's not working for me anymore. And I recognize that. I mean, I'm thinking of the way, like, every so often I like go into my YouTube history and just delete it. And I just start over because I get into some kind of like it's trying to learn me and like it gets me into some weird hole that I'm like, nah, I'm not liking this anymore. I'm not liking the recommendations. I don't remove my subscriptions, but whatever it was trying to do dynamic recommendations is just not working. And I just have to hard reset it. But I feel like there's not as fine-tuned abilities for me to go in and update my preferences and say a recommender algorithm system. But here it's a little different because arguably if it's just a text file, I could go in and read that. I guess, yeah, maybe interesting thing for our listeners here, like open up your memory file.
Well, I was going to say some of my students back in fall actually dealt with the problem of memory and had some really interesting concepts around how to do memory management. And I'll post some of those in the show notes as well. I think that's probably our show for this week.
Wait a minute, but Dan, I'm sorry. Did you say you have a new book?
I do have a new book that is coming out in October called The Restoration. And it is a book about what happens if the United States fell apart in the next 30 or 40 years and we were recolonized by the British. And the British are governed and overseen by a hyper-intelligent surveillance AI known as the Sovereign. And so this is a first book of a planned trilogy coming out in October 27th at a bookstore near you. Yeah, if you're interested, I've got the sample chapter up and a bunch of the glossary and a map and some other stuff. So if you're interested in AI and science fiction, perhaps this book is for you. I'll post the link again in the show notes. And on that note, we will really wrap up the episode. Thanks for listening to AI and Design Pod, aka Magic, and we'll see you back here for next week. Have a great summer. Stay cool.